The Space Force budget is 3.4% of DoD's total, right? So a very, very small share. But what I tell my friends who are in the national security community but are not focused on space is if you want to understand what the administration is trying to do from a national security perspective, you need to understand the Space Force budget.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week, late Wednesday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that's aiming to at least streamline, if not slash, regulations that govern the space industrial sector. The EO is called Enabling Competition in the Commercial Space Industry. Among other things, the president is directing the Transportation Secretary, who also happens to be serving as the acting NASA administrator, to conduct a review, essentially hunt for regulatory requirements to eliminate. The focus seems to be on rules for launch and re-entry vehicles, and the order puts state environmental regulations in the crosshairs. The review is due in 120 days. Also this week, the National Guard Association alerted its membership that the president is breaking a campaign promise he made to them. Nearly a year ago, then presidential candidate Trump appeared at the National Guard Association's annual meeting. On stage, he told attendees that if elected, he would create the Space National Guard. This idea would have allowed the more than 1,000 highly experienced and skilled Air National Guardsmen and women in 14 units across 7 states to continue to carry out national defense space missions and also serve their states. But that promise seems to have evaporated. Air National Guard space units have been told that they are to surrender their missions to the Space Force by October 1st. It should be noted, National Guard space units, at least for the next month and a half, represent more than half of the nation's deployable offensive capabilities. But speaking of executive orders that are shaping the space domain and the industrial sector, in this episode, we're going to take a wide-angle view of just what the Golden Dome executive order and the plus-up in money for the Space Force is revealing about this administration's national defense strategy. I'm joined by Sam Wilson and Peter Garretson. Here's our conversation. Hello, Sam. Peter, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Laura. It's good to be back.
Great to be here.
So let's start this off with a quick round of introductions. And Peter, why don't you kick this off?
Thank you, Laura. I'm Peter Garretson. I'm a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council and the author of several books on the U.S. competitive position in space.
And everybody, you are hearing airplanes in the background because Peter is in Orange County, California, next to John Wayne Airport. So we're going to hear that for a little bit. And Sam, what about you?
Thanks, Laura. I'm Sam Wilson. I'm with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, which is part of the Aerospace Corporation, where I lead our strategy and national security team.
Excellent. Thank you both again so much for making the time. Now, last week, Matt Lohmeyer, and Peter, please do correct me if I am saying his name incorrectly, because I do know that you know him personally. In fact, wasn't he your student?
Matt was a star student, actually, in his class when he went through the Schriever Scholars Program.
So, well, as you know, he actually entered the Pentagon, I believe it was last week, to take up his duties as the Undersecretary of the Department of the Air Force. And he is space-minded. He is a former Space Force Guardian, in fact, and he is now responsible for organizing, training, and equipping both the Space Force and the Air Force. And that means he is going to be right in the thick of it in executing the Space Force's 2025 budget. The money that is coming out of the recently enacted budget reconciliation bill, that's the one that most refer to as the big, beautiful bill, And assuming that he stays on for the full term, he'll also be in charge of the 2026 budget and executing that as well as the next 3+ years, right? So at the beginning of his time, there's going to be a huge one time $40 billion infusion of cash into the Space Force for 2026. Now, Todd Harrison calls it a one time sugar high because there is no publicly known plan to sustain this level of funding in the following years. But nevertheless, Sam, you say in your most recent report on the space related aspects of the defense budget that the money and the legislation itself could have far reaching and long term effects on the Space Force and quite possibly the Department of Defense. What are you seeing that those of us who are closer to the flagpole are missing? What's the big headline here? What have we missed?
Yeah, great question, Laura. So, I mean, it is an influx of money for a service that has a constrained budget, right? At a minimum, and I think we all recognize that. But what I think is really intriguing is what this money and what the reconciliation bill says about how the Space Force and how defense space activity in general is becoming more central to the Pentagon's plans, right? And I think of this principally with the emergence of Golden Dome. This is, to me, the most important national security priority for the administration, and this has a heavy focus on space. And so we can think of this as, yes, an influx of money, but what it's revealing about the nature of how the Pentagon is thinking about defense space activity, I think could be more impactful from a longer term perspective.
Peter, you're nodding.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that in terms of national policy change, Golden Dome is as big a policy change as the creation of the Space Force to begin with. And to me, what Sam has highlighted in his paper really brings to the front what I think is really exciting, which is that this is the first time we have really seen a major shift towards entirely new capabilities and programs. For decades, military space has been extremely stagnant. We have had missile warning, we've had weather, we've had launch, we've had military SATCOM and GPS, but we are now looking to add, essentially 3 completely new lines of effort that will create 3 entirely new career fields. So, we have detecting threats from space, which involves, ground moving target indicators and air moving target indicators, which have broad utility far beyond just Golden Dome. And then we're having space-based interceptors that, is a remarkably big and important achievement. So I think this is a really, really big deal that will change the tribes, the tribal alliances, the importance of the Space Force, not just in the space domain, but in any terrestrial conflict you could imagine.
Yeah, and I would just add, if I can, Laura, that you think about the reconciliation bill, you think about this, for FY26, you mentioned this influx of money for the Space Force, 13.8 billion. Adding that to the 26.3 billion that's in the space budget, that's in the budget requests, that would amount to a 40.2%, or that would amount to a 40% increase from last year's appropriations. But what's thinking about pulling out Golden Dome, right? The reconciliation bill contains 24.4 billion for Golden Dome, but President Trump said that this is going to be 175 million over 3 years, right? So
Billion.
a lot.
Billion, my friend.
Oh, did I say billion? 175 billion over 3 years, and you think about the heavy focus that the Golden Dome money has for space. That's going to really be, if that actualizes, that would be transformative for the amount of funding that we've grown accustomed to for the Space Force and defense space activity more broadly.
Well, that kind of leads me right on to this, right? Because will this really stick past, say, 2030 or 2035? And I think this is important because how the money became available is not normal. The process is weird. It's hard to follow. It's not in a regularized budget process. Yes, some of it is like what is it? The 26.3 billion is in the normal regularized budget. But then there's 13.8 billion from a reconciliation bill. We don't know if that's going to happen again. And then there's that 7.7 billion that's going somewhere space related. Can you just give a brief, and I do mean brief because we want to save, some time for more of the meat of this subject, but yeah, where are all these buckets of money coming from, and actually also where are they going? Because if I'm not mistaken, you've also broken up some of this. I think it's 21.6 billion into two big buckets, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And then there's so much confusion about this year's budget process, right? Because you have two completely separate legislative processes that are affecting the budget, right? You have the normal appropriations process that, again, we've seen the budget request for. Right now, the congressional appropriations committees are working through their differences about what that could look like. Perhaps we'll see an appropriation, perhaps we'll see a continuing resolution. But then you have this reconciliation bill that is distinct from the appropriations process because this isn't just for 1 year money, right? This is from FY25 through FY29. The 13.8 billion that we keep talking about is what the administration has said it plans to spend for the Space Force in FY26, right? So this is of the amount in the reconciliation bill, which could be spent from FY25 through FY29. They are saying 13.8 billion will be spent in FY26. However, that's not all of the defense space funding in this bill. I count, and this is based on my characterization. I find $21.6 billion worth of space projects in the Reconciliation Act. So if we then say, okay, 13.8 billion for this is in FY26, then we're seeing the rest of this perhaps in future years. Not all of this may go to the Space Force, right? We're not seeing in the Reconciliation Act the level of specificity and detail that we see in the budget lines as part of the normal budget process. But I think a lot of this will, right? I think a lot of this will. Again, we'll see more money from the reconciliation bill for the Space Force in the years to come. But again, a big chunk of this is planned for FY26.
And just to clarify, though, Sam, before we move on, because some may get the impression, and maybe it's a correct impression, I'm not sure, but when we're thinking about the $21.6 billion and the $13.8 billion of that going to the Space Force, are there actual budget lines as to where this money is going to? And then there's the $7.7 billion that's going somewhere space related. Then there's thoughts of INDOPACOM. I mean, that's a combatant command, right? Where some of this money may be going to. It seems very opaque.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you could slice this. So again, the Reconciliation Act includes 21.6 billion in space, what I would call space-centric projects. Of that, some of that, the bulk of that money is in a section called Integrated Air and Missile Defense, which is what the administration and what the Armed Services Committees have alluded to is Golden Dome. This is the funding for Golden Dome is in Integrated Air and Missile Defense. Not all of that funding is for space, but most of it is, which is why, I think it's really important when we think about the future of Golden Dome that we're really thinking about the future of, to a large extent, the increase in defense space funding and the centrality of national security space for this administration. So that's one piece of the reconciliation funding. Then there's this other section that is capabilities in support of Indo-Pacific Command. And this also contains a number of space projects, things like space situational awareness, things like X-37B, even things like ground moving target indication programs, which is interesting because also ground moving target indication programs are also being funded under the Integrated Air and Missile Defense, right? So you have these, the Armed Services Committees in developing the national security portion of the reconciliation bill identify different capabilities under these different sections, right? And many, and again, in these two sections, in support of Indo-Pacific Command, as well as what we're calling Golden Dome, a lot of this is for space. However, some of this is going to be spent in FY26. That's where we get that 13.8 billion number. And then the remainder would be spent from FY27 through FY29.
Okay. So if this is sustainable and if of what you're saying is correct, this could be a shift of responsibilities and programs from certain service branches to the Space Force, maybe in reverse. Maybe you could give us some examples, and you'd have to have the question, would these things remain in effect, let's say in a following administration, right? And we should probably start with the big one, with Golden Dome. Right. A few weeks ago, Golden Dome czar General Michael Gutlein said that an architecture plan was still being developed. We know that space-based interceptors is the real goal, but how many, how to build and scale that capability and the needed industrial base, all of it's really exciting, but there are unanswered questions and the clock is really ticking here because we've got 14 months until the midterms and 38 until the general election. But assuming that it gets up in orbit and there are successful demonstrations, even then there will be those who will say that space is, well, just a part of the Golden Dome. And they may even argue that it should be under the Air Force or perhaps somebody else. So I'm just kind of wondering, how sustainable this is going to be. Is it really going to stick? And I'm tossing this one to you, Peter, because I know you really think about this.
Well, Laura, Todd has suggested that this, is a one-time sugar high and won't be sustained. But, the converse way to look at this is that if you started a teenager down having, super gulp Coca-Colas, they develop a sweet tooth. And so I think it's quite likely that if the Space Force is able to quickly deploy these capabilities, the entire Joint Force and National Security Enterprise are going to like that capability a lot. And therefore, not only that you develop sort of this iron triangle where you've got contractors that are getting paid and want to see that continue, you have legislators benefiting, you have the service itself that will benefit. So I think it's quite possible that this strengthens the hand of the Space Force in having larger budgets in the long term if they play their hands right. But as you pointed out, one of the concerns about the amorphous way that this reconciliation bill has put things in is that I think it does offer the possibility of internalizing the fight over that budget in the Pentagon. And it has been a consistent worry of mine that the intent of the administration to develop space-based interceptors would be poached by the broader integrated air and missile defense, where you have, existing renters on the budget, in the Army and Navy that want that capability to just build out the systems that they already have.
So they can have a budget grab. Exactly.
So I think that's, there is absolutely the possibility of a budget grab on the table, but also, if the Space Force and the Department of Air Force plays their cards right, I think that Sam is correct in seeing that there is a clear shift in priorities to space. And again, I just want to hit on my earlier point that we are developing 3 entirely new mission areas that have never existed in the Space Force or its predecessor Air Force Space Command before, that will require entirely new command and control structures, workforces, internal tribes, and the dependency of the Air Force, the ground force, the Navy on air moving target indicators and ground moving target indicators and everything else that those systems allow, will also shift everything, the balance of power generally.
And speaking about, moving target indicators wherever they may lie, there's a shift going on there, right? So how will that work? I mean, is this an opportunity for the Space Force to really lead that?
Yes, absolutely. So, if you look at what it would cost to recapitalize, the the current air-based way that we track moving targets on the ground, JSTARS, that recapitalization was estimated to be somewhere between 7 and 9 billion. So you can round up and say 10 billion. And AWACS, which is the air moving target indicator, that was estimated to be 15 to $19 billion. So collectively, that's $25 to $28 billion if you're going to do that versus trying to do it in space. And on top of that, just the bill for the maintenance and flying hours of those, each one is about $1 billion a year. So if the Space Force can rapidly deploy a significant constellation for air and space-based, you may be cutting your long-term, bill for those services by quite a lot in the long term.
It seems actually in the short term, sorry to cut in, but just to kind of, put a fine point on what you're saying exactly, and perhaps maybe what the thinking is inside the Pentagon. But yeah, the E-7 Wedgetail Airborne Battle Management and Targeting Platform, right? This is a thing that's under development. It's from Boeing. It's on a Boeing jet. It's for AWACS. It's supposed to replace the E-3. And it's in the 2026 budget, but in name only. The budget is zeroed out, which makes some wonder if the E-3 AWACS jets are even going to be replaced, right? And there's a bigger fight for this at hand. I mean, retired Lieutenant General Dave Deptula thinks for space-based assets to take over the mission entirely, the required technology he thinks is many years, if not decades away. Is he right about that?
I personally don't think so. My concern would not be that space-based moving target indicators could not provide a superior and global level of service, and ultimately at a lower maintenance cost. I have some optimism about that. I think, the larger question is that whether they're in the air or in space, both systems are going to have some level of vulnerability, and that's just hard to get around.
Sam, you've got to stop raising your hand and thinking that people out there in the podcast verse can actually see you. You need to actually just jump in.
Sorry, Laura. I just want to underscore how important I think this debate is, right? And how and to me, how it reinforces the narrative that we've talked about earlier. This is a mission that for ground moving target indication and air moving target indication that has been carried out with crewed aircraft. And you're seeing with the emergence of this new air moving target indication effort, as well as the ground moving target indicator spacecraft program that we've seen for a couple years, a transition of this mission from air to space, right? So again, I just think this is reinforcing this story that space is becoming more important for the long-term vision of what the Pentagon is trying to accomplish. And I mean, on this specific question on the air moving target indication, I would just say that it's an open question, right, of what happens. We've seen Congress indicate that they're not so keen on canceling the E-7 program. We've seen that in the HASC bill, in the SASC bill, as well as in the HAC-D. Mark. So, the HAC-D is the House Appropriations Committee, as well as the Senate and House Armed Services Committee bills. So I don't know what will happen, but again, I think it's interesting and it's worth noting that this is yet another example of space becoming more important for what the Pentagon is trying to do for its core missions. Laura, if I can just one note on Golden Dome on this question of kind of will it survive administrations? I think one thing that was interesting is seeing how many of the current budget lines would be funded using Golden Dome funding. Assuming Golden Dome funding is this reconciliation bill funding, you can see in the budget request that several existing programs, things like resilient missile warning for low Earth orbit, things like polar missile warning, things like medium Earth orbit missile warning. So we're seeing existing programs. We're seeing national security space launch infrastructure funded under this. So there's a lot of different initiatives that to me were already things we were doing just with additional resources, which is of course in addition to the new missions, right? And Peter's talked about this. I mean, we haven't had a public space-based interceptor program since the Ronald Reagan administration. So that would be a huge shift. But a lot of this is, in some ways, you could say this is a continuity with the prior administration as well as the first Trump administration.
I want to mention something. Sam, when you say that, we're shifting a mission from air to space, that's true. But it's like if you lived in a large apartment building and your only means of light was carrying around a hurricane lamp in your house, and then you suddenly went to, central electric lighting across the whole thing. What space-based moving target indicators do is, instead of having 3 or 4 aircraft that you need to maintain one sortie to look at one small area of the world, you now have continuous moving target indicators across the entire globe, not just some tiny part of Europe or Indo-PACOM. That's always on. And so the step change in that utility, yes, it's the same service, but it's service of such a different kind.
It's of magnitude, right? It's of magnitude. And I know that there are companies that are trying to step up to leverage AI to make that coverage not just global, but to bring the clarity down to under a meter, or under half a meter or a quarter of a meter. And they're really looking at delivering exactitudes here. And what I find, just to also say that this is definitely moving forward in some manner. At least they're looking at how to make it move forward, because it was last week that Lieutenant General Deanna Burt said that an analysis of alternatives for air moving target indication will be finished, and it will be finished this fall. So stay tuned, folks. But for all of this, right, just like I said, that there are some commercial players looking at how to leverage AI. I think it's Maxar in particular that's trying to do that. That's commercial. That's the commercial sector, the non-government sector. And we have been hearing for a long time that the government wants to leverage the commercial sector. And I do say we've been hearing it for a long time because that's kind of what we hear. There's the investor point of view that companies will not invest in developing technologies on spec. And that has remained a hurdle, right? You can send up flares saying, hey, we need this, the demand signal, but has the money really been there? And some companies have felt burned by that, right? And this is a crucial part, I think, of this budget, at least according to you, Sam, because as my boss, Vago Muradian of the Defense and Aerospace Report says, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. Will this infusion of cash light that rocket and keep it lit? Sam?
That's a great question, challenging question. I think it's interesting and worth noting that, right, this year's request introduces a new budget line for proliferated commercial SATCOM, and specifically proliferated LEO commercial SATCOM. And it's, 190 million. And I know that's not a huge amount, but that's the biggest commercial services budget line we see in the Space Force's budget outside of launch, right? So still pretty significant, and perhaps a forerunner for what's to come. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the last several years that the department and the Space Force need to go much further in leveraging commercial services for national security missions. I think a really interesting question is when we see perhaps the service forego traditional acquisition and rely entirely on a mission for commercial services. We haven't seen that yet, but this is still a new budget line that is the biggest commercial services budget line for the service, again, outside of launch. So I think that's interesting. And again, I think this could be telling and revealing for where the administration is trying to go more broadly with some of its national security priorities, right? We've seen a shift toward and discussion of emphasizing non-traditional defense players, not necessarily the primes. So we'll see how that gets realized in the years to come. But again, this one indication that we see in the budget, I think, is revealing. And I think, again, 190 million, not a huge share, but still much higher than what we've seen in the past.
So just staying on that, how do you think this is actually really going to affect acquisition? I mean, you said non-traditional players, perhaps non-primes even. Is this really going to happen this time? And I say this time, and I say it this way cynically, just because, I mean, for as long as I have been covering Space Force, I've been hearing the same thing. right?
Right.
And when you in the beginning, again, investors were there and saying, "Yeah, we'll go and we'll fund it and we'll do this and we'll do that." And now there's excitement because of Golden Dome, because they see that the money is there. They see that that the commercial sector is going to play a massive role in making that happen. But there's also a little bit of trepidation. Is it going to go beyond the primes? Are they really going to go to the non-traditional players or the folks that are delivering deep tech, bleeding edge capabilities? Or is it just talk?
It's a hard question, Laura, and you're right that there's been so much talk about acquisition change, but I think there is, what I sense is that there's significant appetite for acquisition reform, and again, I think what will happen in space will be interesting for because we might be able to take that and expand it to what we see the broader Department of Defense consider for acquisition changes. So I think I can't tell you whether this is going to be the moment that everything is going to change,
Oh, why
but
not? That's why I have you on the podcast. Come on.
but but certainly there's a lot of people clamoring for it, right? And processes are hard to change, right? Like this is not, there's a reason why this hasn't happened yet. But again, I think there's a lot of appetite within the administration, within Congress, for trying to actualize some of these changes, and I think space could be a forerunner for broader reforms.
Laura, the way I look at this is I think the Space Force has actually done a truly laudable job, really since its first year in trying to really open up and look at what the commercial sector is doing, listen to them to try to open up these new avenues via these TAC-FIs and STRAT-FIs, and try to understand the venture capital community and try to source ideas. And that's still a fairly small effort, and it's remarkably difficult to transfer from being a small company to being a prime with all the needs for connectivity and all the various requirements that sort of drive larger and larger organizations just to be able to keep up with the meeting and compliance loads of the DoD. But there are these new sort of intermediate steps that it can bring companies closer. And so what I think we haven't really seen yet, and hopefully this is the sign of things to come, is just more budget empowerment, because I think the commercial sector is mostly limited by the size of contracts that are there to actually instantiate new business members. So hopefully this is the sign of things to come. Past State of the Space Industrial Base reports have suggested that there be a specific set aside single digit percentage of commercial procurement, and perhaps to locate that within the program management offices themselves. But we haven't seen anything that bold yet, despite the setups of Cosmic and Castle and other things to try to reach out more. I will say that I recently published something on the potential use of working capital funds that I think could really catalyze and improve this. But yeah, I think commercial is limited by budget lines and money for commercial.
Well, I'm going to have you come back on the podcast and explain that. But we are running out of time, and we are over time already. But I think it's really important that we answer or attempt to answer this question. And that is, what about the effects on the Space Force and the balance of power inside the Pentagon? I love the Space Force. You guys love the Space Force, but let's be real. It is very much seen as the junior partner. It's the youngest service. It has the least number of uniformed personnel. It still has the smallest budget by far. If this all plays out, what will be the effect, though, inside the Pentagon? We're already seeing the U.S. Army making a space play. This fall, we could see a new enlisted occupational specialty even inside the Army. I believe it's called 40D, Space Operations Specialist. What could we actually be witnessing right now? And if there is a shift, is it sustainable? Could it be rolled back?
I'm happy to jump in and then have. I know Peter's going to have some thoughts on this. I would just say that yes, the Space Force budget is 3.4% of DoD's total, right? So a very, very small share. But what I tell my friends who are in the national security community but are not focused on space is if you want to understand what the administration is trying to do from a national security perspective, you need to understand the Space Force budget, right? And I truly believe that. And I've never said that before. But I think, for all the reasons, Laura, that we've talked about today, right? The emergence of Golden Dome, the shift of certain missions from other domains to space, these changes that we're seeing in commercial space. I know they're subtle right now, but they might become more significant. These are really important for understanding the administration's priorities. And again, I just think that we cannot overemphasize the importance of Golden Dome, right? This is an initiative that is both the subject of an executive order in the first week of the administration, as well as a presidential press conference. So I just think this is more central to what they're trying to do from a long-term defense perspective than we've seen before.
So, I would say, Laura, that it is the Space Force's game to lose, that they have been put in a position that if General Gutlin can deliver and actually give us a minimum constellation by the time of the election, Golden Dome will be a permanent fixture. It will be too embarrassing, even if you have a change of power to a Democratic administration. They will not think it is okay to remove a shield over the head of the American public. So if we can rapidly get to testing and rapidly get to at least low rate procurement and put something up, which frankly, I think is within the cards of the $5.6 billion that they've put out, because if you adjust for inflation, what SDIO spent last time on Brilliant Pebbles, you say a test campaign of $2.6 billion, that leaves you with $3 billion that you could actually procure, depending on what your assumptions are for how much a Pebble would cost compared to a SpaceX Starlink satellite. If it was the same price, it'd be 1,700. If it was 10x, it'd be 170. And even if it were 100x, you'd still have, 17, which I think would still be, enough to be considered a novel service. So the Space Force, and as Sam, pointed out, even if you go with the CBO estimates that are pretty high compared to past expectations of what it would cost to put up a large constellation, 161 billion over 20 years, that's $8 billion a year. That's not even 1% of the DoD budget. And if you go with their super high estimate of 542, that's 27 billion a year, which is 2.7%. So those are meaningful. They still don't approach the size of the Army or the Navy's annual budget. But once the Space Force has actual weapons in space that could do harm, it will be taken more seriously. And as they proliferate these capabilities of moving target indicators for air and ground, they will be absolutely essential to joint operations everywhere and become only more important. And I think long term, unless there's something truly catastrophic that happens, the trend is for space to become more important to society and commercial, and that to increase and to become more important and integral to joint operations. So it's hard for me to imagine a future in which the Space Force budget is not going to continually be growing.
Sam, Peter, thank you both so much for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.